Elfberg. Miral murmured. He died today. Osrith looked to the Wessex men again. I am sorry, she told him. I'm not. He stole my wife. He made me a debtor. He shook his head. He died a long time ago for me. And Osrith knew what he meant. Not only was it that she had given up hope of meeting the Utad of her dreams, kind, welcoming, and yet, there was still hope. Look, said Eswi, pointing behind Osrith. She turned, and saw two figures approaching on horseback. One, in actual fact, was on ponyback. Look at that, Finan said to Utad, as they stood in the southwards quarter of the field and watched the king of the West Saxons approach Osrith with her son. I always knew she was in love with Edward, just chose to ignore it. It had been a tough battle, mainly because of how easily the Norse under Ragnall had fallen the first 3 times. They watched as Edward held on to young Finan's rein, seemingly reluctant to let the child go to Osrith. Utad raised a hand as he watched Finan making to go to them. Then they watched Osrith approach, with young Finan beside her. And in front of all of the men, those of Alba to the north of them, the Strathclydians, Mersons and even Sigtrygg's men, Osrith stood before Finan. Ignoring things seems to be a common theme today, Utad replied, eyeing his sister and his nephew, as he considered how the left flank of Norse had been ignored by the West Saxons, which had caused their forces to be split. I know this is not the Cove, I know this is not Bibbenberg, Osrith declared, in front of anyone who could hear. But she said no more when Finan broke from Utad's side and rode to her, glancing skeptically at the figure of the Wessex king. They rode south for a while, putting the battlefield behind them. No one stopped Osrith, nor even cried out to her. Young Finan rode silently at his mother's side. This is young Finan, she told Finan, who only had eyes for the boy. And Osrith saw a side to the man she loved that she had never seen before. He stooped, and took young Finan's rein, before leading him about 10 feet away from Osrith, in her sight perfectly. He spoke to Finan Beak softly, though Osrith did not catch all the words, and their son looked to his father, listening to what he had to say, and replying every so often. Then, he brought him back before Osrith. He likes reading, and poetry, Finan told her. Our mother's father was a Sinchai, a law teller, Osrith said. Finan smiled. There is not a lot that you don't know. And then Finan brought his horse close to hers, and bent his head, putting a hand to the back of Osrith's gently. She gave in, all the feelings in her body overcoming her will to resist. Are you sorry you killed your brother? She asked, afterwards. No, Finan told her. Are you sorry I ride with yours? No, she replied. I love you, Finan of the Ullaid. Finan Moore, my heart is your heart. I am to be married, at Constantine's wish. At this, Finan pulled his horse away from Osrith as if he had been struck. What is the man's name, Osrith? Finan asked her. It would have been better, Osrith thought, if Finan had reacted in some way, shouted, or told her that he would stand in the way. It was his cold acceptance that she found hard to bear. Sainid, Osrith told him. Cousin to King Constantine. And then Finan said no more. With one glance back to his son, Finan of the Ullaid flicked the reins of his horse and urged it away from Osrith and young Finan, and on to his lord. 88,888,888. It was 20 miles from Corbridge when Utad was overcome with the urge to tell his dearest friend he was sorry that he had harmed her as he had done. Who? Finan asked. They were heading east, towards the coast, where a boat was coming to collect them to take them to Frisia. Osrith, he told him. Finan smiled, faintly. That is the first time you have used her name without adding an insult to it, he told Utad. Besides, Finan added, shaking his head, whatever you did it cannot be as bad as what I and my brother did. Finan murmured. What did she say? Back there? Just the 3 of you? Ahead, the non-existent boat had pulled up to the Kirjaro. That she would hate you until death and will kill you the minute she had the chance, Finan said, shaking his head, sadly. What did she really say? Utad asked, equally softly. But Finan sheathed his sword, glancing north. So are we to Bibbenberg or aren't we? 88,888,888. Of course there was no chance that Osrith was going to be able to make it back to Dunnottar before King Constantine, nor least, be able to hide that she was away from the fortress with young Finan. It was Domhnall who met her on Corbridge's southern bank before the tents of the Mersons, before even she had time to see her old company, or even Aethelstan. I cannot help you out of this one, Domhnall told her, and he was there beside Osrith when Constantine listened to her excuse, a mile away from the Mersons and the West Saxons. He made her get down from her horse, and stood in front of her, cold anger in his face, not caring that the whole of his army saw, in front of the Mormers, in front of young Finan. My patrol took me further south than I intended, Osrith told him. It was the wrong thing to say. The old Constantine returned, and he pulled her to him, forcefully, before holding her shirt. Then, raising a hand, he hit Osrith around the face, before throwing her from him. He was just about to raise his hand again when Domhnall was beside him, no, in front of him, blocking his line to her. What do you want, Constantine? She managed, through winded chest. I went to Bibbenberg. I was looking after my interests. Where? He is here, somewhere, but she broke off, for Constantine's face looked blacker than ever she had remembered seeing it. You will ride with Domhnall back to Dunnottar. You will prepare for your marriage, he told her. The day I return, you will marry Senid, Constantine continued. The day I return. And with that, he pulled himself back onto his horse and rode past her, leading his army west.